Hello, everybody. This is Room and Board. I'm Zachary Groombridge, and this is the Rulebook Club. It's the monthly show where we talk about a rulebook, usually for a tabletop role-playing game, sometimes for a war game. We stretch the gambit. This month, we're doing our Bonanza, or my Bonanza. Chris has been sent a number of games, I think 6 games total, from different companies and people wanting to promote their games, and he sent all of those to me, and I've read them all. And I'm going to try to put out a review for all of those games this month. This is the first game in the series. Originally, my plan was to squeeze all of the games into a single video. I tried to record that. Turns out, when you try to discuss 6 wildly different games mechanically, you may end up making a mess of a video. So instead, I'm going to try to do more of my normal style video on the games. First game in our Bonanza series, Dragonbane. Dragonbane is a tabletop role-playing game, a traditional fantasy tabletop role-playing game. Dragonbane, I had a little bit of an emotional roller coaster reading it. So I opened up the book. I was sent a digital copy, so I opened up the PDF, I guess, and I turned the first couple pages, and it leads off straight away with this sort of lore description. What is this game about? It's about, fantasy adventure, and it gives the sort of the history of this fantasy world that you're going to be playing this role-playing game within. And it was the most generic little blurb of a fantasy world's history I have ever read, right? Demons and dragons are fighting each other. One represents chaos, one represents order. They destroyed each other, their empires fell, and now they're slowly rebuilding themselves. And you, the player characters, and the other younger races of the world are rising up to sort of fill the void. And this is real traditional fantasy flair. This is the most vanilla thing ever, right? I think in more modern games, the idea of chaos versus order has sort of fell by the wayside, and tabletop role-playing games and fantasy fiction in general has sort of leaned more in the direction of good versus evil. But if you look into the past, sort of before the rise in popularity of like Lord of the Rings, the dichotomy was less good and evil and more chaos versus order. And modern Dungeons & Dragons sort of splits the difference. It's a 4-way scale instead of a 2-way scale, right? You have the axis of good and evil and the axis of chaos and order. Yeah, so I read this description and I was like, oh, this is going to be super generic, super boring. And then, I start reading through the book a little further, and it gets right into, like a lot of these tabletop role-playing books, they get right into character creation. So I started reading character creation. I'm like, yep, these are generic. You can be a generic human. These are generic dwarves and generic hobbits and generic elves. Yeah, this is all like super bland vanilla fantasy stuff. And I was looking at these special rules that all these different races would receive if you played them, and a lot of their abilities seem to me to be references to other fantasy sort of universes or milieus, right? The dwarves, for example, have the ability to hold a grudge against someone, and in the rules for holding a grudge, it says, oh, maybe you want to write the grudge down in a book just to remember it, because you get this bonus if you're ever acting on a grudge. And that immediately reminded me of Warhammer Fantasy. I don't know if this is a trope with dwarves that sort of predated Warhammer Fantasy, because Warhammer Fantasy is what sort of introduced me to this concept. I think Warhammer Fantasy has popularized the idea of dwarves having a book of grudges. That's like one of their big sort of gameplay thematic defining qualities in the Warhammer setting. And so, I read this rule on these very generic dwarves, and I was like, okay, they're not only generic, they're also like a little derivative. These races and classes and things you're going to be playing are going to be the most generic of the most generic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because, sometimes people want to play in a generic traditional role-playing game setting. They want to sort of know what to expect. And I liked the idea that, okay, yes, this is generic, and yes, you can sort of pull in tropes that you like from other fantasy universes, there's like a quiet wink and a nod towards that. And I kind of liked that, but I was also sort of like, I was kind of deep into this book now, and I'm a little like, oh, okay, yeah, this is just totally expected. And then I turn the next page, and the next class that you can be is Donald Duck, and yeah, you can play a duck person in this game, and they look a bit like Donald Duck. This one looks like Scrooge McDuck. That one is Darkwing Duck. Lots of duck people, and I was like, oh, this is peculiar. This is new. This is decidedly not generic. What is their explanation for this? Like, how does this hook into the grand story of this tabletop role-playing game? There's duck people. And the sort of setting description for this very non-traditional sort of class type is somehow duck people became a thing. No one knows why. The end. Then the class ability for the duck people, who are called mallards in this game, their class ability is to get very angry. And I'm like, is this a reference to Daffy Duck getting sort of incoherently angry and spluttering and quacking? And I think it is. It was just peculiar. And then I turn the page, and, you can also play a furry in this game. You can play a wolf person. And I think that this little journey I've gone on from incredibly generic fantasy world, incredibly generic fantasy races, random off-kilter duck character, kind of half-expected animal person, / wolf person. It kind of is emblematic of my sort of journey through this game, seeing everything that I sort of expected to see, and then a couple little off-kilter surprises in there, and that sort of extends to my whole reading of this book. So what kind of game is Dragonbane? What kind of conversation does it want you to have? I think it wants you to have the same kind of conversation you have in the most generic kind of tabletop role-playing game I can think of. It's Dungeons & Dragons. It wants you to journey towards a dungeon, complete the events in a dungeon. It wants you to have a fight against a boss, and then leave the dungeon. And there's plenty of rules in there to adjudicate the travel, plenty of rules to adjudicate the fighting things in the dungeon. Not a whole ton of rules about how to play the dungeon itself. There's a couple rules about, how to run traps and things like that. But there's not like a really in-depth sort of dungeon exploration rule set in here. But I was reading this game and I was like, this is a very competent game that is very competently wanting you to explore the same sort of genre fiction that a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game wants you to explore. I think your conversations are going to be largely the same, with the exception that there's going to be less discussion about what your characters are going to be doing when they level up, right? There's going to be less sort of complication when it comes to the combat, because this game has a simpler combat system. I think it's pretty clever. I think it's pretty clean, but it's going to be simpler. So there's going to be less talking about what everybody's character around the table is capable of doing. There's going to be less discussion about who's going to be using what powers when. It's going to be more, it's going to be a little bit more streamlined. There's not a whole lot of tools for role-playing in this game. I mean, no more than there are in Dungeons & Dragons. It is mechanically, the game is very focused on getting to a place where there's going to be conflict, and then resolving that conflict, and then bringing the loot, the treasure gained from that conflict back home. If you're used to playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, I think you're essentially going to be having the same conversation in this game. But just like my experience reading this rulebook, where I got the most generic thing I could possibly imagine, and then random Darkwing Duck, I think that there are a couple interesting little takes on very traditional tabletop role-playing game sort of format and play style that are minor, but I think add up to making something kind of unique in an unexpected way, while still feeling very familiar. Let's talk about mechanics. So if you've played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, I think a lot of the mechanics in Dragonbane are going to be very, very familiar. One of the principal things I can think about is, hey, if you've played Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you know what advantage is, and you know what a disadvantage is. When your character has advantage, you roll 2 dice and you take the higher of the 2 results. If you have disadvantage, you roll 2 dice, you take the lower of the 2 results. And something that has sort of been an issue in the Dungeons & Dragons community, I think it's sort of been hammered out in convention since, but when Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition first came out, there was this advantage and disadvantage system, and in a lot of situations you really needed advantage to succeed in a lot of situations, but the ways that you awarded advantage and disadvantage to players was kind of unclear. There was a lot of debate and discussion when 5th edition came out, like how do you give out advantage and disadvantage? The advice that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition gave you was like, hey, as a GM, when someone is role-playing particularly well, you award advantage. And when something happens to a character that you don't quite know how to mechanize, you can give them disadvantage. And that's sort of how it was suggested you play it. But in practice, what that ended up creating was players who didn't roleplay a lot would roleplay a little bit and get rewarded with an advantage. And players who roleplayed all the time, they wouldn't constantly be given advantage because it was sort of the expected thing. And so maybe they would get advantage at the same time as other players, maybe they wouldn't. It was just sort of unequal, right? You sort of just had to feel it out. And that's what I mean when I say it's kind of been worked out through convention nowadays, right? The sort of the community has arrived at some preconceived notions about like sort of when you give out advantage and disadvantage. Some supplements and like house rules have sort of created clearer distinctions about when that is given out. But if you've read Dragonbane, you'll see that advantage and disadvantage is in this game as well. Like, it's a very familiar system. In Dragonbane, it's called giving banes and boons. They work much the same as advantage does in D&D 5th edition, except in Dragonbane, it is very absolutely clear when you gain banes and when you gain boons, unlike advantage and disadvantage. It is a central game mechanic. Like many of the player's abilities, skills, heroic actions, many of the monster's abilities and attacks, they tell you explicitly when you gain banes and boons. And I really like that about this game. I like that it is very clear about this very familiar system, right? It's innovating with the most vanilla generic thing you can think of. Advantage and disadvantage has just become a staple at everybody's table if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition just kind of does it poorly. And here we have Dragonbane using essentially the same system and doing it very cleverly and integrating it throughout the game. Right? Every player is going to have very clear avenues of gaining banes and boons, and it's not going to come down to sort of rules of convention or sort of what the community or your gaming group has sort of settled on as what feels right. Right? There's a way that it works and a way that doesn't work, and I think that's really cool. There's a lot of mechanics in this game that make me feel like whoever designed this game played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and house-ruled stuff to make it work better. I'm going to talk a lot about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in this review, and I think your feelings on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition are going to dictate whether you're actually interested in Dragonbane as a game. Something that comes up when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is a lot of people really enjoy playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in the first couple levels, like levels 1 to 4, right? And that's because in the early Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, characters have low HP. There's not a whole lot making character classes different from each other. And you can wind up in situations where a party of 4 people runs into a bear, or to an owl bear, or to a single monster, or to a group of small goblins. And that engagement, that conflict is exciting, it's frenetic, players can die, there's stakes. But as Dungeons & Dragons sort of continues its progression systems, classes start unlocking new features, new feats, new amazing things that they can do. And by level 5, characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition have like wildly diverged. They've chosen like secondary paths for their classes. Some people will start multi-classing, and changes completely. That like tense, anyone could die at any moment, tension of the first couple levels gives way to this sense of everybody's playing a superhero capable of doing incredible things. And as your class level progression continues in Dungeons & Dragons past 5th level, you start getting into ridiculous territory. Characters get extra attacks, and the entire math of conflict explodes, right? You'll have late level characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Essentially, the combats with them will take forever because everybody has so many moves and actions. People have multiple attacks, and it can be really hard to dungeon master D&D 5th edition if you've only played the first couple levels, because the game plays completely different with mid-level characters. And the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition supports incredibly high-level characters with incredibly difficult to build combat encounters for. Like, the game changes multiple times, and the thing about Dungeons & Dragons is very, very few groups of players ever actually play the game long enough to reach super high level in that game, right? You look at a level 20 character and you're like, wow, if only I can ever get there. And you're going to play a campaign and you'll end at level 6 or 7 and you'll never see that high level game. But yeah, people who play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, a lot of people really enjoy those first couple levels and enjoy the game less when they have more powerful mid-level heroes and never see the game when they're using their top level characters. And how does that change in Dragonbane? It feels like the game has focused itself to try to emulate that first couple level experience of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and make that the whole game forever, right? Characters will get sort of tougher and more difficult to kill, but there's no leveling up per se in Dragonbane. Your skills are going to get better over time. You're going to unlock new heroic abilities to enact. You're going to find new spells. You're going to get new gear and equipment. But essentially, the combat is going to remain the same with very low experienced characters and very, very high experienced characters. I think, for the most part, a lot of monsters that couldn't threaten an early campaign party are still capable of threatening a late game party because they aren't level. And I think that's just cool. And again, very, very vanilla. There's nothing super standing out here. But I think the game is well designed, and there's that little quirky twist. There's a duck in my vanilla cake, and I find that duck delightful. More mechanics, because there are more, and I'm spending a lot of time talking about Dungeons & Dragons. Something that sets Dragonbane apart is you're very rarely, if ever, going to be using DC, like in Dungeons & Dragons. What's DC? It's like a dice check. In Dungeons & Dragons, if you wanted to stab a monster, that monster is going to have an armor class. And when you roll your 20-sided dice, you're going to have to roll equal to or higher than that creature's armor class, plus your bonuses and things like that in order to hit it, right? I want to stab you with my sword, I have to roll a d20, and the game master is going to tell you whether that d20 is higher or lower than the armor class of that character. And there's a lot of guesswork going on, right? Like, I'll roll a 20 and hit a character, but no one around the table knows what that character's actual armor class was because I rolled a 20. Someone will roll a 13 and miss, and so, okay, we know that the armor class is between 14 and 20. What is it? And we're going to there's going to be a lot of sort of figuring out what this mystery number is, and it bogs down the game just a little bit, but this is a holdover from the days that Dungeons & Dragons was a war game. It's been included as like a mechanic in tons of different tabletop role-playing games since. It's just sort of convention. It's vanilla. And essentially that's still how it works in Dragonbane, except you don't roll against the armor class of the character you're trying to stab. Right? You have a sword skill or a spear skill, and when you want to hit something with your sword, you're trying to roll below or equal to your sword skill. So if my skill is 10 with a sword, I roll a d20 and I want to roll 10 or under to hit. That's going to be the same no matter what I'm fighting, whether it's a goblin or a dragon. I'm going to have to roll a 10 on my sword skill to hit. So it's a known number. There's no guesstimating what I'm after. You can always sort of know how good you are at trying to hit a thing. I like that quite a bit. There's also a feature in this game is like, there's an initiative track, you draw cards, you find out where you are on the initiative track each round, and if you have not acted, yet on your turn. You haven't taken your action, and a creature attacks you, you have some defensive options. If you take one of those defensive options in Dragonbane, it'll consume your action on your turn. I believe you still get to move, but it consumes your action, so you won't be able to attack someone. And some of those defensive actions are you can parry, you can dodge, and parrying and dodging are tied to skills as well. So you can dodge anything, right? A guy comes at you with a sword, you can dodge it. A monster breathes fire breath at you, you can dodge it using the dodge skill. So if you have a character and you've pumped up your dodge skill, you'll be able to dodge attacks from all kinds of different characters and people. You can play sort of a dodge tank, which is kind of cool. But if you've spent all of your skill points on the dodge ability, you can't turn that dodging skill into damage at any point. Like, you can't attack with your dodge skill. However, let's say my character, I've been pumping at my sword skill. I can use that sword skill to attack. I can also use that sword skill to parry, which gives you some more flexibility. So you could also pump up your sword skill and be sort of a parry tank, which I think is cool. Or you could be a damage-dealing class that's using your sword. You have that flexibility. So you might have a character who is statted really hard into dodging, and a character who's statted really hard into parrying. And that parry character can also fight pretty darn well because they've statted into parrying. But there's also a little caveat. Monsters can be dodged. Monsters can't be parried. So if you're fighting a dragon, your character who has a ton of sword skill is not going to be parrying the dragon. You're going to be stabbing the dragon, and you're going to be relying on your dodge tank to dodge stuff. If you're fighting a group of town guards, you might be relying on your sword wielder to parry a bunch of attacks, and you might be relying on your dodge tank to start dealing damage. I think that's clever. Built right into the game of Dragonbane is an item durability. I really like this, right? Swords have a durability. You lose durability when you parry with your sword. You lose durability when you attack some things. Some monsters have abilities that reduce the durability of your weapons. Characters can carry on them at any time, sort of freely accessible, up to 3 different weapons. So there's a very real chance, and shields have durability as well. So there's a very real chance that, like, you're in a fight, your sword breaks as you parry the guard, you whip out your spear, you pull out your shield, now you're fighting with those. You're in a situation where, okay, I could parry with my sword, or I could parry with my shield, and I could, do that. Or maybe I don't want to parry with my shield because I want to use the shield to help me block damage from a dragon or something. So I'm going to parry with my sword, but that's going to break my sword. That's okay. I'm going to have to pull out another tool. I like that little tiny shake-up to the combat formula. I think it makes it interesting, doubling down on what made early versions of Dungeons & Dragons interesting, which was all combat, all dungeon exploration, all world exploration was really focused on spending resources and forcing players to spend resources. So adding durability to all these weapons and armor and things like that, it really doubles down on that focus, right? It allows you to put players in situations where your magic sword that you got from a wizard, or that spear that the Lady of the Lake chucked at you, might be amazing, but you're whittling down the durability of it. And when and where you invest its durability points on your adventure it matters. One of the things I was looking through the different classes you can start the game as, and a lot of them totally very expected. Oh yeah, you can be a wizard, you can be a knight, which is essentially a paladin, you can be a thief, and then boom, once again, that little spice, that little duck in my vanilla cake, you can also just be a weapon crafting, like, blacksmith. And I thought, oh well, what is the spice that makes taking a blacksmith as a class interesting? And the blacksmith can repair durability on stuff. It's like having a healer for the equipment of the party. And I think, man, that's so cool. You might have a party of characters that doesn't have a healer, but has someone who can fix all your equipment. And that might cause everybody to look for ways to spend the durability of your weapons and armor and things like that as ablative HP, right? You might be focused really hard as a party on parrying and relying on the armor to fix your weapons between combats. You might have a healer and no armor smith, and then the challenge of deciding when and where you apply your weapons and things like that can be really interesting. Another thing that just makes it a little different from Dungeons and Dragons is in Dungeons and Dragons, if you wore armor, it would change your AC, right? It would make you harder to hit. An enemy would have to roll higher on the dice in order to hit you. That's not how it works in Dragonbane. Instead, armor just reduces damage, right? You wore plate armor. It's going to take off a huge chunk of damage when you take a hit. And different kinds of armor in Dragonbane are good against different things. Chainmail, kind of weak against piercing attacks. Plate mail, really strong against piercing attacks, right? So you might have a character who's walking around in plate mail and then bumps into a guy with a warhammer and is in trouble specifically because the warhammer is going to ignore a bunch of the damage resistance. You might be walking around in plate armor and bump into a guy with a knife and laugh in his face because the knife ain't doing too much to you. I like that. The overland travel rules, super clear. I would use them. I would use them and be happy about them. And overland travel rules are something that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition doesn't do so well. There's a big chunk of Dragonbane that is discussing, hey, how do you forage? How do you hunt? What do you hunt for? When you do hunt, how many resources do you get for killing a thing? I think it's all really clear. It's all hooked into these skills. Again, as I said earlier, there's no leveling up in Dragonbane. What there is increasing skills, and there's quite an expansive skill list. I think it's done pretty well here in Dragonbane. The skill list isn't too absurdly large. I think most of the skills have a very clear in-game use within the structure of going on a journey, going into a dungeon, fighting a boss, going home. Right? I think a lot of games that have skills that you pick and develop have a lot of extraneous skills. This is your fungus knowledge skill, which you roll when you want to specifically have knowledge about fungus. This is your stone building skill, which is different from your wooden building skill, and it lets you know the way to properly build or destroy a stone building. When are you ever going to use that? There's nothing silly like that in Dragonbane, so I think it's probably going to be pretty usable. And like I said, a lot of the skills earlier, like if you had the sword skill, created a really great opportunity for use in combat and out of combat. There's lots of different sort of debilities you can get attached to your character that give you big sort of minuses, right? Your character can become angry or exhausted, and these hurt your character. They make rolls harder. They reduce your stats. That isn't super new. I think there's something quite similar to that in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but it's not done quite as well. And where in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, it sort of just usually comes down to the Game Master being like, oh, I feel like you have this condition in this situation. Again, in Dragonbane, really clearly mechanized. You always know when you're going to be getting a condition and what the mechanical results of that are. I know the Berserker, there's a heroic action called going berserk, and when you go berserk, you have to fight. You're not allowed to retreat until everything that's living that's an enemy within sight has been killed. When you go berserk, you get the angry trait, so it hurts. I think it's willpower. Any skills or abilities that have anything to do with thinking get damaged when you're angry. And when you're done going berserk and everything's dead, you have to take the exhausted condition, which hurts your I think it's your constitution, so it's going to hurt your health and your ability to do a bunch of different things. So it's active. It's built into the abilities that you get to use. I think it's really slick. I think a lot of parts of this game are really slick, kind of innovative, and while at the same time the game is not doing anything particularly new. It's a vanilla cake with a duck in it. And you know what? I think I love the duck, and I'm okay with vanilla cake. And that's my feeling on the mechanics of this game. There's a lot more in here that's cool. Oh, wait! Before I move on from mechanics, we have to talk about the monster design in this game, because I think that's another thing that makes this game really cool. In the bestiary at the end of this book, I got to the bestiary and I was like, I bet I'm going to turn the page, and I'm going to see Dungeons & Dragons stat blocks for these monsters. And I think if there's one thing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition does not do particularly well, it is monsters. If you want a Dungeons & Dragons that does monsters really well, look to 4th edition, because I think that edition did some really clever things. But anyway, so I got to this section in Dragonbane, and I flipped the page, and I was kind of delighted. So monsters have an HP, obviously. They have I think it's a Furiosity is what it's called, the Furiosity rating, which is how many turns they get in the initiative, so how many cards they're going to draw from the initiative deck each run. And then they have a big chart. And I was like, what is this? Every time a monster or an enemy makes an attack in this game, it rolls on the chart to see what kind of attack it makes. It's not something that the GM chooses, although there's a little caveat. Yeah, the GM could choose anything from this list if they want, but they roll on it. And I think that's super fun, because you never quite know what the monster is going to do on its turn. I think with the first monster in the bestiary was a demon, and I was reading through its abilities, and one of its abilities is Curse. So, the GM might move the monster or the demon next to your character and then roll on the chart and say, oh, okay, well, it's going to curse you. And then there's another chart saying what kind of curse it was. And I think it's the first option on that, what kind of curse it was, is that the demon points at you, and the next time you lie, a frog will pop out of your... And that's it. And right, there was a much more horrifying things on this demon attack chart that could have happened, much more terrifying curses, but, in a game where you're fighting a demon, you might fight a ton of demons over the course of a campaign. You'll remember that one time you fought a demon, and he pointed at Jim and cursed him, and no one knew what that curse did, and then a session later he tried to lie to a barmaid, and a frog popped out of his mouth. And you're also going to remember that time when you fought a demon, and he pointed at you, and he hit you with the curse of death, and Jim just fell over, right? Creating these, really memorable situations, and all these creatures and monsters are going to behave wildly and randomly, and I think it's kind of clever and cool, right? You're going to fight a dragon, and the GM isn't going to know whether the dragon's going to breathe fire at you. It could slash at you. I know the harpy, one of the attacks it has, I think it's just called void bowels, and it says the harpy flies over, or the nearest character to it, the harpy voids its stomach and its cloaca in all directions, and blinding and debilitating everyone around it. And you can block it with a shield. You might fight harpies a dozen times in your campaign and never have it void its bowels on anyone. And then you're going to fight a harpy, and it's going to void its bowels on everyone and give everyone a bunch of status effects, and you're going to be the only one who has a shield out and able to block it. And that's going to be a memorable moment. I think that's a really fun way to play monsters. Enemy. I think that's it. I think that would make combats refreshing in a lot of ways. I think that's cool. I don't know how that would play out in combat, but I'm excited to play with the monsters in the bestiary. And usually I get to the bestiary and I'm there to look for ideas rather than to actually use them as written. Another thing I just sort of really like about random charts in general in role-playing games, and Dragonbane has lots of random charts, is from the Game Master's perspective, random charts give you an idea of the breadth of things that can happen in the world you're playing in. I remember, there's some role-playing game supplements that are just full of random charts. Like, hey, you want to play in this kind of world? Here's a bunch of random charts about what can happen in that world. And usually when I get one of those books full of random charts, I've never actually rolled on those random charts. But reading through those charts gives you such a clear idea of the many different things you can do to flesh out a setting, to create situations, to create locations and things like that, right? You could decide as the game master to throw a demon at your players, and you read through this random chart of things that the demons can do, and you might choose not to use that random chart, but now you have a very clear idea of the kinds of ways a demon can attack. You can make your own chart. You can make up your own actions on the fly, and having that random chart gives you a bunch of cool ideas of what demons are capable of, right? One of my favorite things to do when I'm using random charts in a game is after I've used an element on a random chart, I erase it and I cross it out and I write a new thing. So if I ever roll that number on the random chart again, I'll do that new thing instead. And I think I think getting to the bestiary and to see sort of the possibility space of the game explode outward rather than contract in, I think that's really clever and really fun, and something I really like about Dragonbane. Let's stop talking about mechanics. I think it's probably going to be our biggest part of the discussion because the most is going on there. If any of you have played Dragonbane or even looked at it or maybe watched a Let's Play, I'd be really curious to know, like, what did you guys think of it? What do you think about the rules here? It feels to me like such a sort of a cleaned up version of someone's house rules for Dungeons and Dragons. And I really like it for that. I'm really curious how it plays on the table, because I started out not being super impressed with what I saw and becoming more and more impressed as I read through this book. Have you guys heard of Dragonbane? And if you have, and if you've played it or read it, I'd love to know what you think. Moving on from mechanics, let's talk about setting. This is going to take a half second because we've already talked about setting. The art in the book, pretty all right. I love the ducks. The ducks are fantastic. A lot of the art has character and things like that. It doesn't super stand out to me. A lot of the big splash pages are pretty. They're very colorful. But they're just very sort of generic. They could be from any fantasy setting you can dream of. They don't do a whole ton for me. But every time I see one of these ducks, I love them. I think all the characters have a lovely amount of character. The pages in this book all have, especially in the class section, have little in-universe quotes from in-universe characters. I love to see this in a tabletop role-playing game. They give you such a good amount of flavor about what the world feels like. And all of these quotes in these book are a little tongue-in-cheek. They have a little duck in their vanilla cake. You're reading about knights, and a little quote about knights. It feels a little sardonic, right? It's a little cynical, a little making fun of the idea of knights. And I think that tone, I wish it was stronger throughout this book, throughout the writing of this book. I wish it was a little less generic in its art, and a little bit. I wish it leaned into how quirky it is. The rules are there, and I think they're strong. I think they're like surprisingly strong, and they're more surprising because the rest of the game feels so unsurprising. The art, the design, the story, the setting. I wish it took a bigger swing at doing something a little different. I mean, that's what I feel, but the book is pretty. There are a couple things when I was reading this book, and I was going back and I read it, like, I think 2 times. When I went back the second time and there were certain rules I wanted to double check and clarify for, like, hey, how does willpower work? Where do you, how do you gain it? How do you lose it? How do you determine how much you have? Because willpower points are a thing you can spend. Here I'm talking about mechanics again. Willpower points are a thing you can spend to do special abilities, and I want to double check I knew how that worked before I talked to you. And I couldn't really find it. I flipped through the book a bunch. I went to the index. There isn't even a W in the index. It's not alphabetized all the way to W. And the one reference in the index has to wisdom sends you to the page that mentions wisdom for the first time, but not the one that tells you how it works. So there's a couple little reference-y aspects to the book's layout that I don't think are great. But I think all of that is mostly going to be an issue when you first play the game. As you play the game, it's going to clean itself up. But yeah, not a whole lot there to talk about setting-wise. Let's go to our last pillar. How should you use this game? Should you use this game? I think if you really like the first couple levels of Dungeons & Dragons, like levels 1 to 3, you like that experience, those kinds of adventures, and you want that experience to last longer and to have a little bit more depth, Dragonbane's for you. I very briefly looked up reviews for this game, and all of them said, like, oh, it's OSR for a new generation. And I think that's being a little disingenuous. I think a lot of people, when they see a tabletop role-playing game that is playing in the same game space as Dungeons & Dragons, jump to saying, oh, it's like the OSR, right? When they see a game that's using the same sort of stats, using similar dice, using similar mechanics, but maybe making things simpler or cleaner or reducing down some of the bloat, a lot of people jump and say, oh, this is like the OSR. I think Dragonbane feels resoundingly like its own thing. I can see what it grew out of. I wouldn't call it a game that feels like the OSR. I think one of the defining things about games that people say are like the OSR is the games themselves don't really tell you how to play them, right? If you handed a lot of OSR games to an alien and said, Mr. Alien, play this game, the alien would have no idea how to play it. Hand it to a person who has never played Dungeons & Dragons or an OSR game, hand them an OSR game, and they'll have no idea how to play it. Because so many OSR games, the way you play them, it's buried in convention. You know how these systems are supposed to work together because you already know, right? You know how you approach dungeon exploration because you already know. Not because the game tells you, not because these mechanics are very clear, not because the situation, the way you use them is sort of outlined in the rules, not because the designer had a mission statement that they were following, but the culture of the OSR, the OSR community has already decided how this game gets played, and you go in and play it that way regardless of what the book says, because the book doesn't tell you how to play it. And for that reason, a lot of the people who are hooked into that community, when they see games that are being clear about their conventions, being clear about how you play them, and they recognize some of the aspects of the OSR in that explanation, they claim it. Oh, this is part of the OSR. This is just like the OSR. Dragonbane isn't just like the OSR. It is, if you handed Dragonbane to an alien, I think an alien would be able to figure out how to play it. I'm trying to talk about how you use this game. Yeah, I think you could play a bunch of existing modules for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I think you could play a bunch of existing modules for older school role-playing games. I think you could play a really free-form campaign. There are rules in Dragonbane for playing solo. There's a little booklet that comes with this game, or at least the boxed version of Dragonbane. It's 12 pages long. It tells you how to play a solo campaign with yourself. I think it's pretty rules dense and pretty interesting. I'd be willing to give it a go, I think. I think it's better than the Mythic tabletop role-playing game, which was a couple 100-page book that I don't think was as clear or well-written as Dragonbane's solo mode. I don't think a solo mode is how Dragonbane's going to shine the most, but I can definitely see how it could work between monsters that have random attacks and a couple other systems built into this game. I could see you playing pretty decent little combat-focused adventures as a solo player. How else can you use this game? I think there's a lot of mechanics in Dragonbane that if you really like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and you have a group of players that refuses to leave Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you might be able to wean them off of it by bringing them to Dragonbane. And if you can't wean them off of it, I think there's some mechanics in Dragonbane that you could rip out and paste over into your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game to make some things better. I think that might be a little bit of work, but I could see people doing it. All in all, I think it's a pretty slick game. I don't know, how would you guys use Dragonbane? Right? If I was to come up to you and say, hey, here's a versions of Dungeons & Dragons that fixes a bunch of problems you might have with it, and the only issue is it's a little generic, would you be interested? If I gave you the opportunity to play Darkwing Duck in a game, would you take that opportunity? Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. All right, that's the end of our Dragonbane discussion. I hope I was clear. What are we talking about next time? Well, another game that's part of the Bonanza that was sent to Chris was Pirate Borg. Pirate Berg? Anyway, Pirate Borg, which is part of a line of games that's pretty famous now called Mork, from the line of Morkborg. Merkberg? It's like Scandinavian or Swiss or something like that. I probably got that wrong, and I'm going to get a whole bunch of angry comments. It's not how you pronounce it. It's not from Scandinavia. Anyway, Morkborg is a pretty famous, pretty popular role-playing game. Pirate Borg, which is the game I've been sent, is pretty interesting. It's kind of peculiar. I don't think I can discuss it without discussing Morkborg in the same breath. So I think that's going to be our next episode. We're going to talk about Morkborg / Pirate Borg. Who knows? I might dip my toes into Cyborg as well, which is like the cyberpunk version of it. Following that, I'm going to do a short this time. I think I can bang it out in 20 minutes. Brutality Ship Combat. This is a tabletop war game, miniature agnostic, that was sent to Chris. And I think it was sent to Chris in response to my review of 1,000 Suns. I've read it, and I think it's pretty interesting, but I think we're going to do an episode on that. Those are our next 2 books in this Bonanza. They should be coming out, I think, later this month, because I'm going to record them almost immediately. / cut them out of the video I already recorded. And following that, we have a dilemma, and I need your help, audience, to solve this dilemma. So, things I'm interested in reading. I know that mega games, like LARPs, mega games that have thousands of people. I think LARPs and mega games are 2 different things. But mega games that have like hundreds of players that you play at a convention together, I think those are cool ideas. I've never read a mega game, the rules for a mega game. I don't know if they get published in books. I don't know how you get a hold of the rules for like a big mega game. But I'd be curious to if they do exist, to read about mega games and to talk about 1 or 2. Or, I don't know how those are formatted. I don't know how those are distributed. So if anyone out there in the audience knows anything about a mega game, like a game that has 1,000 people in it, I know they exist. I would love, suggest it down below and tell me where to find it, because I want to do an episode about one. And that's something I've never looked at before, and I'd be interested to read the rules for one, because I don't know how that works. I would also be interested in reading the rulebook for a LARP. I'm sure they have a rulebook. I'm sure there's a LARP out there that has like this is how you play, handed to me. I don't know. I'm not a LARPer. I've never gone to a LARP. I would love to read a rulebook for a LARP and discuss it with you. If you know anything about one of those, tell me down below. I would love to talk about it and read about it. And beyond that, there's 2 games that I know people in my audience down below want me to read. So, Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing, and the other one was Mothership. This is my entreaty to you guys out there in cyberspace. If you know about a mega game rulebook, tell me about it. If you know about a LARP rulebook, tell me about it. And then also tell me, hey, do you want me to read Mothership next or Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing? And that's where we're going. So, have I blown your mind with planning for the future? You should be seeing a Mork Borg, Pirate Borg, Cyborg video soonish. You should be seeing a Brutality Starship Combat video soonish. And then I need you to tell me Mothership or Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing, and I need you to give me the deets on LARPs and mega games. And that is that. This was Zachary, and this was the Rulebook Club, and I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful month until I see you next time. I'm probably going to see you in sooner than a month. This was Room and Board. Send all your love to Chris. Send him smooches. Subscribe to him on Patreon. Subscribe, like and subscribe. Have a wonderful time. Ciao.